The courtroom felt like a cage, heavy with silence as my son's words cut through the air. She's losing her mind. Still, I didn't flinch, my fingers steady on the papers before me. As his voice echoed, the faint smell of leather from the chair crept into my senses, grounding me. While his accusations hung in the air, I saw the truth in front of me. His lies, his manipulations. The realization hit. This wasn't about me. It was about him. That's when I smiled, knowing the verdict was already in. He'd lose everything. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The courtroom was cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, making you feel small and insignificant. Maggie felt it, but she didn't let it show. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking over the room before walking in. Each step was measured, deliberate, her shoes clicking softly against the worn tile floor. Her gray hair, perfectly pinned back, framed her sharp face, her expression calm, as always. Maggie had learned the art of control years ago. Now, in the face of her son's betrayal, it was second nature. She looked up at the judge's bench, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if preparing to sit down in front of an old friend, not a room full of strangers. Eric was already at the table, his posture stiff, the suit he wore looking too big, as though it were a costume he had never truly grown into. His eyes were locked on the judge as he presented his petition for guardianship. His voice, when it broke the silence, sounded rehearsed, calculated. "Your Honor, my mother is no longer capable of managing her own affairs. She is forgetful, confused. She forgets things. She's unsafe alone." Maggie didn't flinch, didn't react. She stood perfectly still as the words hit her like a slap across the face. She had always known that Eric was capable of cruelty, but to hear him say it so plainly without a hint of hesitation was a gut punch. Sharon, sitting beside him, nodded dramatically. Her lips barely parted as she looked at the judge, her eyes wide with exaggerated concern, her hands clasped tightly together. Maggie couldn't help but notice the slight, practiced way Sharon adjusted her posture, as if she were already preparing to take the role of Eric's supportive wife, the one who would stand behind him no matter how low he went. Hannah sat at the back of the courtroom, her arms crossed tightly, shoulders hunched. Maggie could see the way she clenched her jaw, her gaze darting between Eric and her mother. There was a nervous energy about her, the kind of anxiety that comes from being caught between two forces you don't fully understand. Maggie's heart ached for her granddaughter, knowing how hard this was for her. But there was something else there, too. Something deeper in Hannah's eyes. Loyalty. A quiet, unspoken bond that Maggie trusted would hold strong in the coming hours. Maggie turned her gaze back to the front where the judge sat, listening intently, as if Eric's words were just another case to sort through, another set of facts to evaluate. But Maggie knew better. The judge had heard it all before. The accusation of forgetfulness, the claims of incompetence. It was a game many had played before. The question was whether the judge would see through Eric's charade. Eric finished his presentation, his words lingering in the air like smoke. He looked at Maggie then, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if daring her to deny the truth of what he had just said. But Maggie didn't speak. She simply stood there, her back straight, her hands still clasped in front of her. The courtroom buzzed faintly with the hum of quiet conversations, the shuffle of papers, the sound of a distant clock ticking down the minutes. But to Maggie, everything was slow, deliberate. She could hear her heart beat in her chest, steady and unshakable, just like her. Her silence was deliberate. She was choosing her moment, choosing her words carefully. The world had always underestimated her, and she'd let it. People assumed she was old, tired, and faded. But they didn't know her. They didn't know how sharp she was, how clear her memory was, How precise her mind remained. The judge turned his gaze toward her then, waiting for a response. The room fell silent. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, low, and firm. "I am not forgetful, and I am certainly not unsafe." Her words cut through the room like a blade. The judge raised an eyebrow, as though this were the first real spark of the fight. Maggie knew what was coming next. She had prepared herself for it. She had prepared herself for every possibility, for every lie, every tactic Eric might try. But even she hadn't expected this. Eric's face, which had been so confident moments ago, began to falter. The sneer that had been on his lips when he made his accusation slowly vanished, replaced by something harder, more calculating. He was trying to recover, trying to regain control of the narrative he had started. But it was too late. Sharon shifted in her seat, a look of frustration flashing across her face. She shot Maggie a glance, the kind of look that tried to mask the tension building in her chest. But Maggie knew. She could feel it. Eric's next words, when they came, were almost a whisper. "She's losing her mind," he muttered, so quietly it was almost as if he didn't want anyone to hear. But Maggie heard. And in that moment, everything in her solidified. She had heard it, and now she would make sure Eric paid for it. The judge turned his attention back to the room, motioning for the proceedings to continue. But the words Eric had uttered, those were the ones that would echo in Maggie's mind for the rest of the day. The sentence he shouldn't have said. And Maggie was about to make him lose everything. The room seemed to hold its breath. The words Eric had just whispered echoed in Maggie's ears, a cruel undercurrent to the already tense atmosphere. She felt her pulse steady, her mind sharper than ever. But the world had shifted now. Eric had made his move, and the court was watching, waiting for her next move. The judge, a man whose face Maggie had never seen before, but whose weary eyes now bore into her, looked over his glasses, his voice breaking through the stillness. "Ms. Doyle," he began, his tone calm, almost detached. "Would you like legal representation?" Maggie remained perfectly still, her posture unwavering. She had been asked the question before, more times than she could count, in situations far less grave than this. The answer was always the same, always clear. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, not a tremor in sight. "I already have one." The words landed in the courtroom with quiet authority. There was no hesitation, no doubt. She wasn't just answering the judge. She was asserting her position. She was here not only to defend herself, but to take back control of the narrative that Eric had so arrogantly tried to shape. A soft murmur rippled through the room, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Those who had expected her to shrink, to buckle under the weight of her son's accusations, might have been surprised by the power in her voice. But there was nothing surprising about it to Maggie. She knew what she was capable of. From behind her, a movement drew the attention of the entire room. Vivian Moore, a woman Maggie had only met recently but already trusted with her life, stood up. She did so with such precision and confidence that the room seemed to shift in her wake. Maggie didn't have to look back to know the impact Vivian was having. She could feel the change in the air, the shift from uncertainty to something that tasted like victory. Vivian's steps were measured, the soft rustle of her crisp suit the only sound as she walked forward. She stood beside Maggie, her presence commanding. In a place filled with sharp minds, Vivian was a razor. And as she turned to face the judge, Maggie knew that this battle had just taken a turn. Eric's face, which had been brimming with arrogance only moments before, was now frozen. It was a subtle change. His jaw clenched slightly, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of frustration. He had expected to be the one in control. But now, with Vivian by Maggie's side, the scales were tipping in a direction he had not anticipated. Vivian's voice broke the silence, crisp and unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, her gaze never wavering from the judge. "We request an evidentiary hearing. We have substantial documentation to present that will prove, without a doubt, that Ms. Doyle is fully capable of managing her own affairs." Maggie couldn't help but feel a slight surge of pride. Vivian wasn't just playing the game, she was rewriting the rules, and she was doing it with the kind of precision that Eric's cheap theatrics couldn't touch. The judge's eyes flicked briefly toward Eric, who seemed to brace himself for what was coming next. Eric's lips parted slightly, his breath caught in his throat. The confidence he had walked in with was slipping, unraveling like thread from a fraying tapestry. Maggie could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, trying to regain his footing, but the ground beneath him was already giving way. The judge nodded slowly, as though taking a moment to consider the request. The weight of the room shifted as the judge leaned back, his gaze moving over the papers before him. He looked from Vivian to Eric, then back to Maggie, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. "I'll allow it," the judge finally said, his voice neutral but final. "We will proceed with an evidentiary hearing, a full review of the facts." Maggie felt a slow, subtle release of tension in her chest. But she didn't let herself feel too much relief just yet. This was only the beginning. Eric might have thought this was his moment to push her aside, to make her invisible. But now the gloves were off. As Vivian gathered the papers she had prepared, Maggie glanced down at the neatly organized stack of documents before her. Every word Eric had said, every accusation he had hurled in her direction, was carefully documented, cataloged, and ready for this moment. Maggie had learned long ago how to keep track of every detail, every word, every slip-up. She had made sure Eric's lies would not go unnoticed. And as Vivian turned to the judge, requesting a time frame for the full hearing, Maggie's eyes remained fixed on her son. Eric's face was hard now, controlled, but Maggie could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. His eyes met hers across the room, and for a brief moment, there was no pretending. The mask slipped. Eric knew, just as Maggie did, that this was only the beginning of a fight he was not prepared for. Maggie wasn't going to just defend herself. She was going to make sure Eric paid for underestimating her. And as the judge called for a recess, Maggie knew one thing for certain. The next round was going to be hers. The office was small but immaculate. The kind of place where every book on the shelf was aligned just so, and each document had its place in the neat rows of filing cabinets. Vivian's office had a quiet authority about it, the kind that felt purposeful, as if it existed for moments like this. Maggie had been here a dozen times before, but today, it felt different. Today, the stakes had been set, and there was no turning back. Vivian sat behind her desk, sorting through papers with an air of calm efficiency, but Maggie could see the underlying intensity. There was no rush, no frantic energy, just a methodical pace, each decision calculated, each step measured. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the back of a chair opposite her attorney, and waited. "I've gathered everything you need, Vivian," Maggie said, her voice steady as ever. "Logs, bank statements, everything. I've kept track of it all. For years." Vivian didn't look up right away, but her hand paused mid-air, a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes. Maggie had never been the type to leave loose ends, and she knew better than to trust anyone, not even her own son. She'd kept meticulous records of her finances for decades, not just for herself, but for moments like this. It was her shield. "I've been preparing for this day for a long time," Maggie added quietly, more to herself than to Vivian. "I won't let him take what's mine." Vivian gave a sharp nod, as if she had heard the words many times before but never took them lightly. "Let's go over everything." Maggie opened the first folder, carefully pulling out a stack of neatly printed bank statements. Her fingers hovered over the documents for a moment, the weight of years of work and sacrifice heavy in the air between them. She laid them out on the desk. Every deposit, every withdrawal, each transaction as clear and deliberate as the life she had built. Vivian flipped through them, her eyes scanning with practiced speed. "This is excellent, clear, detailed. You've kept every receipt." Maggie met her gaze with a quiet pride. "I never trusted him. Not after everything." There it was again, the realization that Eric had spent years trying to control what wasn't his, trying to manipulate Maggie into handing over her hard-earned independence. But Maggie had been patient, biding her time, building a case without him ever knowing it. The door to Vivian's office clicked open, and Carl Benson, the elderly neighbor who had known Maggie for decades, stepped in. He was carrying a thick stack of notarized documents, his face creased with age and experience, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He handed the pile to Vivian, who took it with a polite nod. "I've got the affidavits, like you asked," Carl said, his gravelly voice a comforting constant in a sea of chaos. "Everything's in order, proving her stability, her ability to live independently. I've signed and notarized everything, just like we discussed." Carl had been Maggie's neighbor for years. A former court clerk, he had seen enough family drama to know how things worked. He'd never trusted Eric, and when Maggie had asked him to help, he'd done it without a second thought. Vivian scanned through Carl's documents quickly, nodding with approval. "This will hold up in court. We've got a solid case." Maggie felt a slight release of tension in her chest. She was beginning to see the pieces come together. It wasn't just her voice that would speak in court. It was the facts, the hard evidence, and the people who knew her best. Eric's plan was already starting to unravel, piece by piece. The phone on Vivian's desk rang, breaking the moment. She answered it quickly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened. When she hung up, she turned back to Maggie. "It's your granddaughter, Hannah. She left a message for you." Maggie felt a jolt in her chest. She hadn't heard from Hannah in days. The thought of her granddaughter, caught in the middle of all of this, tightened her throat. Vivian handed Maggie the phone. Maggie held it to her ear, the faint static of the voicemail filling the silence of the room. "I believe you," Hannah's voice whispered, quiet but firm. "I know what Dad's trying to do. I'll be there. I'm with you." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, holding the phone tightly as if the simple words could bridge the distance between them. Hannah was young, but there was no doubt in Maggie's mind that her granddaughter would be a force to reckon with in this fight. Eric had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated Maggie. And now, the tide was turning. She placed the phone down with a slow, steady breath. Vivian was already moving forward, gathering the remaining papers. "We're not done yet," she said. "There's one more thing we need to do. A medical evaluation. I want to make sure we have everything in place before the hearing. It will strengthen your case, Maggie." Maggie nodded. It made sense. She had always kept her health in check. One more detail in a lifetime of preparation. Eric wanted to prove she was mentally unstable, but Maggie had a plan, one that would erase his accusations with hard evidence. "I'll schedule the appointment," Vivian continued. "We'll make sure the doctor's report is on file. It's the final piece." Maggie looked down at the carefully prepared stack of documents, her resolve hardening. The pieces of Eric's web were starting to fall apart, and Maggie was the one holding the scissors. But as Vivian organized the paperwork, Maggie's thoughts drifted for a moment. She knew what Eric was capable of. She knew he wouldn't give up easily, and he certainly wouldn't walk away without a fight. But Maggie had always been the quiet one, the one who bided her time. And now, her time had come. She wasn't just going to win this case. She was going to destroy everything Eric had tried to build. And when she finally stood in that courtroom, the only thing that would remain would be the weight of the truth. The afternoon sunlight streamed through Vivian's office window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. The quiet hum of the city outside felt distant, irrelevant, as though time had slowed to a crawl inside these walls. Maggie sat at the edge of a chair, a quiet, intense focus in her eyes as she carefully unrolled a thick stack of bank statements. The pages rustled as she laid them out, each document a record of the years that had passed, the subtle manipulations that had shaped the family's history. She didn't speak right away, letting the weight of the moment settle between her and Vivian, who sat at the desk, eyes locked on the papers in front of her. Vivian's pen moved rapidly across her legal pad, the scratching sound filling the room as she jotted down notes. But Maggie could feel the sharp attention from across the room, could tell that Vivian was already starting to understand the depth of the situation. The truth was, Maggie had always known that Eric was capable of manipulating anyone who got too close, anyone who trusted him. But she had never spoken of it. Not to Carl. Not even to Hannah. Not until now. She had never fully revealed how Eric had worked over the years to wrestle control from her, inch by painful inch. She had let him believe that she was oblivious to his tactics, but Maggie had always been watching. Always. She picked up the first folder, her fingers lingering on the edge of the well-worn paper. Eric's first attempt, she began, her voice low, almost as if speaking aloud to herself, came when I was still working full-time. He asked me for money, said he needed it for a business venture. Maggie's lips twitched slightly, but there was no trace of humor in her voice. I transferred him 10,000. Just like that. Vivian paused, pen hovering above the paper, her eyes narrowing slightly. What happened after that? Maggie let out a soft sigh, the memories flowing through her like a slow, steady current. He said he'd pay me back. He didn't. But then, a year later, he came to me again, said his wife was going through some things and they needed financial help. She shook her head, the bitterness rising in her chest. I gave him another 10,000. Vivian's pen moved quickly again, taking down the details, the quiet fury in Maggie's voice not lost on her. She could see the years of calculated pressure, the subtle way Eric had worked to create an invisible hold over his mother, using her kindness and love against her. But it didn't stop there, Maggie continued, her voice gaining strength. The requests got bigger. He started asking for more. 15,000, 20,000, always with some new emergency or opportunity. I kept giving because he was my son. And I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that he'd turn around, that he'd change. Her hands clenched, the old pain resurfacing like a fresh wound. But he never did. Vivian sat still for a moment, processing before she spoke, her tone calm and measured. And you kept track of all of this? Maggie didn't hesitate. Every single penny. I kept records of everything. Every transfer, every withdrawal. If I'd learned anything over the years, it was that people like Eric don't leave a paper trail unless they have to, and I wanted to make sure that, when the time came, I could prove he had been taking from me for years. Vivian nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting just slightly. Good, she said, her voice firm. We can use this. These documents. These records. They're going to be crucial in proving that Eric's attempts were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that he thought you wouldn't notice. But you did. Carl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, leaned forward, his old fingers tapping lightly on a thick file in his lap. You might want to look at these, Maggie, he said, his voice gravelly but steady. He reached over and slid a folder across the desk, a stack of old emails printed on crisp white paper. Vivian took it without a word, scanning the first few pages. Her eyes flicked between the emails, her brow furrowing slightly. Maggie's eyes followed her gaze, the familiar sting of betrayal rising again as she recognized the words. The emails were from Eric, sent over the last few years, full of the same patterns: requests for money, desperate sounding pleas, promises that this would be the last time, that things were going to turn around. "I found these in the old files in the basement," Carl said quietly, his gaze soft but unwavering. "Figured they'd come in handy." Vivian nodded slowly, looking at Maggie with a quiet appreciation. "These will solidify the case," she said, her voice firm. "You've kept records, but these emails show his manipulation. The way he pressured you into giving him money, the way he played on your emotions. This is the proof we need." Maggie felt a slow, cold smile tug at the corners of her lips. For the first time, it felt like the weight of the years was finally beginning to lift. She had always been the one who remained silent, who bided her time. But now, the truth was out there, and Eric had no idea what was coming. Vivian set the emails aside and turned her attention back to the bank statements Maggie had laid out, the meticulous organization that was Maggie's trademark. She ran her finger down a column of numbers, her eyes scanning the neat rows. "This," Vivian said, her voice unwavering, "is not a case he can win. This is a clear pattern of financial abuse, and it's all documented. He's been trying to control you, manipulate you, and now he's trying to use the court to finish what he started." Maggie leaned back in her chair, her eyes catching Vivian's for a brief moment. She didn't smile often, but now she did. A quiet, knowing smile, filled with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "No," Maggie said softly, almost to herself. "This time, he loses." For the first time in months, Maggie felt a weight lift from her chest, a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The pieces were in place. Eric's empire of lies was crumbling, and Maggie was the one who held the key. The next round was hers, and this time she wasn't going to hold back. The courthouse felt heavier today. Maggie could sense the pressure, the mounting tension that seemed to seep through the cold stone walls. She stood outside the courtroom with Vivian, her attorney's stern, efficient demeanor a contrast to Maggie's quiet, controlled resolve. They had arrived early, just as they always did. But today was different. Today, they weren't walking in as the defendants. They were walking in as the ones who would change the game. Maggie didn't look at Eric as they passed him in the hallway. He was standing with Sharon, both of them locked in conversation with their attorney, their whispers sharp and tight. Maggie couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. She had already heard everything she needed to hear from Eric. He thought this was a game. He thought he could manipulate his way into taking everything that was hers. But today, the game was over. They entered the courtroom in silence, the low murmur of voices around them quieting as the judge took his seat. Maggie stood tall, her back straight, her hands folded gently in front of her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but it didn't matter. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Vivian was already at her side, a briefcase in hand, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet, calculating focus. She sat at the table, pulling out the motion she had prepared, each page carefully typed, each argument built to perfection. The judge, a tall man with graying hair and a steady gaze, looked up from the bench, signaling for the room to settle. "Ms. Moore, you may proceed," the judge said, his voice crisp and professional. He gave a glance toward Eric and Sharon before returning his attention to Vivian. Vivian nodded, rising with a swift, confident motion. She didn't look at Eric, didn't acknowledge the uncomfortable silence that followed. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the judge, her posture unwavering. "Your Honor," Vivian began, her voice steady and precise, "we are here today to request that the petition filed by Mr. Eric Doyle be dismissed in its entirety. We have gathered compelling evidence that not only refutes the claims made against my client, but also raises serious questions about the motivations behind this petition." Maggie's heart beat in a steady rhythm, each word Vivian spoke driving the final nail into Eric's coffin. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Vivian laid the motion down before the judge, each page filled with facts, proof, and documents that spoke louder than Eric's empty accusations. "We have here, Your Honor," Vivian continued, "a full doctor's certification of Ms. Doyle's mental capacity, signed by a licensed specialist. The doctor has evaluated Ms. Doyle and has provided documentation confirming her complete mental and emotional stability. There is no basis for the claim that she is mentally incapable of managing her own affairs." Maggie could see the judge's eyebrows rise slightly as he scanned the report. The room grew still, the weight of Vivian's words settling into the air. Eric's attorney shifted in his seat, his face tightening. "And in addition to that," Vivian continued, "we have affidavits from Mr. Carl Benson, a longtime neighbor of Ms. Doyle, who can attest to her independence and clarity of mind. Mr. Benson, who has known Ms. Doyle for over 30 years, has provided an affidavit supporting her ability to manage her life and finances without assistance." Maggie felt Carl's presence, even though he wasn't physically there. She knew he had given everything he had to back her up, just as he had always done. She had never asked for it, but Carl had seen the truth, and now he was standing with her, even in his absence. The judge's eyes flicked toward the papers once more. Vivian's words, crisp and calculated, continued to weave a web of undeniable evidence that Eric hadn't even seen coming. "Moreover," Vivian added, her voice unyielding, "we have several years' worth of financial logs, statements from Ms. Doyle's accounts, that demonstrate her financial stability, her clear, methodical organization, and her ability to manage her own affairs. These documents not only refute the claims of financial instability, but also illustrate that Ms. Doyle has been consistently diligent in overseeing her finances, with no evidence of forgetfulness or confusion." Maggie felt her chest swell with a quiet pride. This was the truth, the real story, unfolding in front of everyone. Eric had underestimated her. He had thought she was just a passive victim, but she had been taking notes. She had been organizing, watching, waiting for the day when she could expose the lies and take back her life. And finally, Vivian's voice cut through the tension in the room. "We have reason to believe that Mr. Eric Doyle's motives for this petition are not entirely altruistic. In fact, his financial history with Ms. Doyle raises serious concerns. We are prepared to present further evidence showing a consistent pattern of financial manipulation and coercion on his part, which makes his request for guardianship not just unnecessary, but dangerous." Maggie could see the shift in Eric's posture. His face had grown pale, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew the tide was turning. He knew this wasn't going to go his way. Vivian set the last document down on the table with a decisive motion, her gaze unwavering. The judge took a moment to absorb it all, his face unreadable. "You're requesting a dismissal of the petition based on this evidence?" the judge asked, his voice low but clear. "Yes, Your Honor," Vivian replied without hesitation. "We are requesting a full dismissal. There is no case here. Mr. Doyle's actions speak for themselves, and the evidence before you proves that he has no grounds to make this request." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Eric for a moment longer than necessary. The tension in the room was palpable, and Maggie could almost feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. "I will set a full hearing," the judge finally said, his voice calm but firm. "We will schedule a time to review the evidence in detail. But I must say, based on what I have seen today, I find Mr. Doyle's claims questionable, at best." Maggie exhaled, her heart finally releasing the tension that had been building for months. Eric had come in with his accusations, thinking he could control the situation. But now the tables had turned. The truth was out, and there was no going back. As the judge called for the recess, Maggie turned to Vivian, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," Maggie whispered, her voice low but filled with gratitude. Vivian didn't smile back, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. This is only the beginning, Maggie. But you're in control now. And for the first time in months, Maggie felt it. She was finally in control. The phone buzzed quietly on the kitchen counter, the vibration cutting through the stillness of the morning. Maggie's gaze shifted toward it, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The tone of the text was familiar. Eric's tone, a mixture of frustration and entitlement. The kind of message that used to rattle her, make her second-guess herself. Not anymore. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, but she didn't reach for it. She knew better than to give in to the impulse. He wanted something. He always did. And she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. The message remained unread, a silent accusation in the air, just like all the others. It didn't matter. The truth was already out there. Vivian had already warned her. Don't engage, Maggie. He'll try to provoke you, to push you into a corner. You've done the right thing by staying silent. And Maggie had. She had learned over the years that silence was often the most powerful weapon. Eric had always used words to manipulate, to control. He had never learned that words could be used against him, turned around and exposed for what they were. She set the phone back down, the soft sound of the screen clicking against the counter a small act of finality. There was no need to give him any more of her time. Her mind had moved on from his games. She had bigger things to focus on, things that mattered. In the living room, Carl sat in the armchair by the window, flipping through a stack of documents. He was a quiet man, but his presence filled the room with a sense of purpose. Maggie had asked him to come by again that morning. There was still work to do. After all these years of being underestimated, it was finally time to take control of her life. Carl glanced up as she entered, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "How's the court case going, Maggie?" he asked, his voice calm but with a note of genuine concern. Maggie returned the smile, though it was faint. "It's moving forward. Everything's in place, but I can't afford to be complacent." Carl nodded. "I understand. And don't worry, I'll help with anything you need." There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Maggie had never been the type to ask for help, but she had learned that there was strength in letting others in. Carl had been with her through the toughest years. He had seen Eric's manipulation firsthand, just as she had. Now he was here, helping her install home cameras for her protection, just in case. The tension with Eric was still there, lurking in the background, waiting for its next move. Maggie wasn't foolish enough to ignore that. Eric had always been volatile, and now that he was losing control, she knew he would do whatever it took to regain it. As Carl worked in the background, Maggie moved to her desk. She opened the drawer where she kept her important documents, her will, her estate plan, everything she needed to keep in order. It was time for another update. The changes Eric had made to his life, his treatment of her, had made it clear that he no longer had a place in her future. She took a deep breath, the weight of the decision not lost on her, and she began to make the changes. As she removed Eric's name from the beneficiaries list, a small, almost imperceptible weight lifted from her chest. This wasn't a decision made in anger. It was simply the truth. Eric had shown, time and again, that he only cared about himself, and Maggie had learned to put herself first. The sound of her phone buzzing again broke her concentration. She glanced at it quickly, noting the name on the screen. It was Hannah. She picked up the phone and held it to her ear, feeling a flicker of concern rise in her chest. The soft voice on the other end was hesitant, but there was an edge to it. "Grandma?" Hannah's voice was small, almost lost in the static of the call. I just wanted to let you know. Dad's furious." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers tightening around the receiver. Of course he was. This had been coming for months. The moment Eric realized that he couldn't control her anymore, couldn't manipulate her into submission. He wasn't used to losing, and now, he wasn't going to take it well. Don't worry about him, sweetheart, Maggie said, her voice steady, though her heart clenched. I'll handle it. Just stay strong, all right? I will, Grandma, Hannah whispered. I know you will. I I just wanted you to know that I'm with you. Maggie took a slow breath, the emotion stirring in her chest more than she would have liked to admit. But she pushed it down, focusing on the calm. She wasn't going to let Eric tear apart the people who mattered most to her. Not now. Not ever. When the call ended, she sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. But she didn't falter. Maggie turned to look at the home cameras Carl had just installed, and then back at the will on her desk, the changes she had made now final. She felt a quiet strength settle in her bones. Eric was playing his games, trying to manipulate, trying to destroy. But Maggie had been waiting for this moment her entire life. She had seen through the lies, the manipulations, and now she wasn't just defending herself. She was taking back control. And as she sat back in her chair, the phone on the counter buzzed again. Eric's name flashed on the screen, his message taunting, demanding. But Maggie didn't reach for the phone. She didn't need to. She had already won. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting faint stripes across Maggie's kitchen table. The air was cool, a slight breeze moving the curtains as Carl continued to help her organize the final pieces of her defense. They were in the home stretch now, and every detail mattered. Maggie had been preparing for this moment her entire life, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. The email Vivian had discovered, the one that Eric had sent in the dead of night, filled with threats masked as concern, was the final damning piece of evidence. Vivian had added it to the file with a matter-of-fact precision that left no room for doubt. The subject line had been innocuous enough. Important, we need to talk. But the contents were a carefully worded ultimatum, a demand disguised as a suggestion. Maggie sat in her favorite chair, the wooden one by the window, staring at the screen in front of her. The email was open now, a glaring testament to Eric's manipulation. Mom, it's getting harder to ignore the signs. You're not handling things the way you used to, and I think you need help. I'm just worried about you. If you don't do something about this, I will have to step in. Please, don't make me do that. She remembered reading that message for the first time, how it had twisted in her chest, how the guilt had gnawed at her for a moment, how it had taken every ounce of her willpower to resist calling him back. But she hadn't. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't concern. It was control. Always control. Vivian had been the one to point out the hidden threat in those words. If you don't do something about this, she had said, mimicking the tone in an eerie imitation, I'll have to step in. Maggie clicked the email shut and moved to her desk, where her updated estate binder sat open. The pages were organized meticulously, each section labeled and tabbed, every detail precisely in place. The changes to her will were final, Eric's name now absent, his influence now non-existent. Her granddaughter, Hannah, was named the sole beneficiary. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she had done the right thing. This wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. Ready for the next step? Carl asked, pulling her from her thoughts. Maggie nodded. I think so. He handed her the notes they had worked on together, the ones she would use to prepare for her testimony. Her hands trembled only slightly as she skimmed the notes. She had been through the details 100 times, but now that it was becoming real, she felt the weight of the truth like a heavy stone in her chest. The facts were undeniable. Eric had crossed lines Maggie had never allowed anyone to cross before, and now she would make sure he understood the consequences. The emails, the financial documents, Carl's testimony, all of it was coming together in a way Eric had never expected. Maggie wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was building a case that would strip away everything he had taken. But there was one more thing to do. She opened her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and paused. Eric's name was still in her emergency contacts. She stared at it for a long moment, the name glaring back at her as though mocking her once more. With a steady hand, Maggie removed his contact from the list. She didn't need him. She never had. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the familiar sound almost jarring. She glanced at it briefly, and once again, Eric's name flashed on the screen, his message demanding her attention. She let it sit there, unread. She had nothing to say to him. Instead, Maggie stood, walked to the door, and stepped outside. The sky had cleared, and the crisp autumn air filled her lungs as she made her way down the driveway. The world felt both expansive and quiet, the stillness of the morning offering a brief moment of peace before the storm of the hearing began. As she reached the riverbank, Maggie took a slow, steady breath, watching the water ripple gently in the cool breeze. This was her refuge, a place where the noise of the world could fade and her thoughts could settle. The world felt right here, uncomplicated, unthreatened. She sat on a large rock by the edge of the river, the soft sound of the water brushing the shore filling the space around her. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt a calm she hadn't expected to find. This wasn't just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming her life, her peace. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and let the cool air brush against her face. There was something profoundly simple about this moment, something that made everything else fall into place. Maggie knew that no matter what happened next, she had already won. She had taken back her independence, her dignity, and her future. When she returned home, she would sit with her binder, her notes, and prepare for the final battle. But for now, in this quiet, fleeting moment, Maggie allowed herself the luxury of peace. When she finally stood up and turned toward the house, the buzz of her phone still sat unanswered on the kitchen counter. Eric's words had lost their power, and with each step she took back toward home, Maggie knew it. She was ready for whatever came next. The fight was hers to win. The courtroom was cold. Even in the early spring, the air inside felt stiff, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Maggie sat in the front row, the smooth surface of the wooden pew cool beneath her fingertips. Vivian was seated beside her, flipping through papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Maggie's hands rested in her lap, but her mind was already several steps ahead. She had prepared for this. She had learned the art of patience, and now she was about to see it all pay off. Eric's attorney, sleek, well-dressed, with a polished air of arrogance, was speaking to the judge. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as if he had delivered the same argument in countless courts across the state. "Your Honor," the attorney began, his tone dripping with condescension, "there is clear evidence that Ms. Doyle is not fully capable of managing her affairs. Her behavior has become erratic. She's forgetful, confused, and she is putting herself at risk." Maggie's eyes narrowed, her spine straightening as the attorney continued. "She is, simply put, unstable," he added, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. The judge's gaze flicked from the attorney to Maggie, his expression unreadable. He was waiting for her to respond. She could feel the weight of his stare, the expectations, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to Vivian, who had been poised and calm through the entire proceeding, and watched her lawyer's confident demeanor. Vivian rose from her seat, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't look at Eric or his attorney. Her focus was solely on the judge. She was a force of nature in that moment. Cool, calm, unyielding. "Your Honor," Vivian said, her voice sharp and clear. "The claims that Ms. Doyle is unstable are simply not supported by the evidence we've presented." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Maggie watched as Vivian approached the judge's bench, placing a thick stack of documents down before him. "We have timestamps, financial spreadsheets, and medical evaluations that clearly show Ms. Doyle's ability to manage her own affairs. The very idea that she has become forgetful or incapable of making decisions is simply untrue." Vivian's voice was steady, unwavering. She wasn't just defending Maggie. She was tearing apart the case Eric's attorney had built, piece by piece. The attorney's confident smile faltered as Vivian continued. "These financial records prove, without a doubt, that Ms. Kate Doyle has been managing her assets carefully and methodically. She has remained independent, capable, and in full possession of her mental faculties." Vivian turned to Maggie, her expression softened, yet firm. "We also have a medical evaluation that further affirms Ms. Doyle's cognitive abilities. These documents demonstrate that Eric's accusations are unfounded." Maggie could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders as Vivian spoke. She had spent years feeling the pressure of Eric's manipulation, the constant undermining of her choices. But now, with every word Vivian spoke, she was watching the foundation of his case crumble. It was like hearing the first few cracks of a dam that had long been threatened by the rising tide. But then, the mood shifted. Eric's attorney, visibly rattled by Vivian's irrefutable evidence, stood and turned toward Maggie with a thin smile, his voice smooth but insidious. "Your Honor," he said, "we have reason to believe that Ms. Doyle's granddaughter, Hannah, has witnessed firsthand the decline in Ms. Doyle's behavior. We intend to subpoena her to testify regarding the instability she has witnessed." Maggie's chest tightened at the mention of Hannah's name. She knew exactly what Eric was trying to do. He was trying to manipulate Hannah, to use her as a pawn in his game. The thought of it twisted Maggie's stomach, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. Vivian's eyes flicked to Maggie's, catching the subtle shift in her posture. Vivian gave her a slight nod, the unspoken message clear. "We won't let him use her." "Maggie," Vivian said, turning to face her client, "you don't have to worry about that. Hannah won't be coerced." Maggie nodded, her lips pressed into a firm line. She had never discussed her granddaughter's loyalty in public, but she knew where Hannah stood. She had witnessed the quiet strength in her granddaughter's eyes, the fierce loyalty that hadn't been shaken, even when Eric had tried to turn her against Maggie. As the court recessed for a break, Maggie sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had watched the lies, the manipulation, the constant pressure from Eric. But now, in the cold light of truth, his efforts were unraveling before her eyes. Carl entered the courtroom during the break, carrying a stack of freshly printed documents. He glanced at Maggie, his face warm with reassurance. "Everything's ready," he said quietly, setting the papers on the table. He had prepared the court-ready copies of the evidence, the meticulously organized stack of emails, financial statements, and witness affidavits that would seal the deal. Maggie took the papers, her fingers skimming over the edges as she felt the weight of them in her hands. Each page was a testament to her strength, her determination. She wasn't just sitting back anymore. She was taking charge, and with every document, every piece of evidence, she was reclaiming control of her life. As Carl sat beside her, Maggie glanced at the judge who was returning to the bench. Her heart beat steady and strong in her chest, the calmness of her resolve holding firm. She wasn't just waiting for the final verdict. She was already winning. The judge called the session back to order, and Vivian stood again, poised and unwavering. This was it. The fight was far from over, but the outcome was already clear. Maggie felt herself growing stronger with every moment, every step. And with that strength, She knew. Eric had already lost. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that seeps deep into your bones. Maggie had just finished her afternoon tea, the cup sitting empty on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. Her mind had shifted from the courtroom, where the battle for her independence was playing out, back to the calm of her home. But then, the sound broke the stillness. A knock. At the door. Maggie's heart skipped, a quickened thump that rattled her nerves. She wasn't expecting anyone. She moved quietly, almost instinctively, toward the small hallway by the front door. The thick wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. A quiet reminder of the home that had withstood so much in the years she had lived here. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of fists pounding on the wood. It was aggressive, demanding. She recognized that knock all too well. Eric. Maggie paused, standing still in the shadow of the hallway. She glanced toward the security cameras Carl had installed just last week. 2 small black circles above the door frame, recording everything that happened outside. She had requested the cameras as a precaution, not knowing when Eric might take it too far. A flicker of movement caught her eye on the screen, and there he was, Eric, pacing back and forth in front of her doorstep. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. He was furious, the kind of fury that burned too hot, too wild, like a man who knew he was losing control and was determined to do whatever it took to regain it. Eric's voice suddenly sliced through the quiet, muffled but unmistakable, carrying through the door. "Maggie, I know you're in there. Open the door." Maggie's hand rested lightly on the doorknob but didn't turn it. She didn't need to. She had been expecting this. Eric's temper had always been quick to ignite, but today it had burned beyond the point of reason. "Maggie, you don't get to do this to me," he shouted again, his words loud and sharp. "You're making a huge mistake. You're destroying everything, you hear me? Open up, damn it." Maggie stood still, her fingers curling slightly, the cool metal of the doorknob under her touch grounding her. She didn't move, didn't even breathe for a moment, watching him through the camera feed. The man she had once called her son was now nothing more than a stranger at her door, someone who no longer deserved the right to be in her life. Then the banging came, violent, fierce. He slammed his fists against the wood, shaking the doorframe. "Open the goddamn door, Maggie," he screamed. "I won't let you get away with this. I will make you regret this." The sound of his rage was like a physical force, pressing against her, trying to push through the walls she had so carefully built around herself. The fury in his voice was suffocating, but Maggie didn't react. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She had seen enough to know how this would play out. He was out of control, and this time, she wasn't going to let him drag her back into his chaos. Carl, who had been in the living room, heard the commotion and stood, walking toward the door with a purposeful stride. He didn't hesitate. His steady steps were deliberate, full of an authority that matched the situation. He reached the door before Maggie did, his broad frame filling the space just behind her. "Eric." Carl's voice rang out, calm but firm. "You need to leave. Now." Eric froze, his fist still raised to bang against the door, his body tense and on edge, caught between the anger that had driven him to this moment and the realization that the game had shifted. He wasn't in control anymore. "You can't just—" Eric began, his voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I'm warning you, Eric," Carl interrupted, stepping closer to the door, his presence imposing. "Leave, or I'll call the police." The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. For a long moment, Eric didn't move. He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, chest rising and falling with the effort to control his anger. Maggie stood in the background, her hands folded in front of her, her stance unyielding, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of the moment, the last remnants of Eric's influence slipping away. With a final, enraged snarl, Eric turned on his heel and stormed off the porch, his footsteps loud as they echoed on the wooden steps. Maggie stood there watching him retreat through the window, his figure disappearing into the distance. She didn't open the door. She didn't need to. She had already won. Carl stood next to her, his expression softening as he watched her. He didn't say anything, but the understanding between them was palpable. They didn't need words to know what had just happened. Vivian called later that afternoon, her voice steady, reassuring. "I'll be adding his behavior to the case file," she said without hesitation. "This is the kind of evidence we need. It'll show the court exactly who he is." Maggie nodded even though Vivian couldn't see her, the relief sweeping over her like a warm wave. With each piece of evidence, each moment of resistance, she was pushing closer to the truth. Eric's tantrums, his threats, they were only making her case stronger. Later that night, after Carl had left, Maggie sat at her desk, a pile of documents spread out before her. She glanced at her estate binder. The final changes had been made. Eric's name was officially gone. Everything had been documented. Everything was prepared. The next round would be hers. Maggie took a deep breath, the weight of the day settling into her bones. She could feel it now, the end of a long, exhausting chapter. And as she looked down at the papers in front of her, she felt a quiet, unshakable confidence. This was it. The fight for her future was finally hers to win. The courtroom buzzed with a low, nervous energy, the quiet hum of whispered conversations filling the air. The atmosphere was thick, the weight of anticipation hanging over the proceedings. Maggie sat in her seat, back straight, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the table. Her gaze was steady, unwavering as she watched Eric across the room. He was seated with his attorney, looking confident, almost smug. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in that familiar, determined way. Maggie knew that look. Eric always carried himself that way, when he thought he had the upper hand. It was a mask of superiority, a defense mechanism he'd worn for years. But Maggie had seen through it long ago. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The air seemed to thicken as the judge looked down at the papers in front of him. Eric's attorney made the first move, standing and addressing the court with practiced precision. "We are here today to establish that Ms. Maggie Doyle is unfit to manage her own affairs," the attorney said, his tone calm, controlled, and smooth. "She has shown signs of mental decline, and we have evidence to suggest that she is unable to manage her finances or make decisions in her best interest." Maggie's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had prepared for this moment. Eric had thought he could break her with these lies, that he could control the narrative. But today, Maggie would prove him wrong. Today, the truth would be undeniable. Eric was called to testify first. He stood and walked confidently to the witness stand, his movements deliberate, as if he were already rehearsing his victory speech in his head. He glanced briefly at Maggie, his eyes sharp, but there was no warmth, no familiarity there, just the coldness of someone who had long since lost sight of the truth. The judge gestured for him to begin. Eric cleared his throat, his voice projecting with practiced confidence as he began to paint a picture of Maggie as someone incapable of managing her life. "She forgets everything," he said, his voice smooth. "She can't keep track of anything. She misplaces checks, forgets important dates. She's been losing control for months." Maggie sat still, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze never leaving Eric's face. The words stung. Yes, but they weren't true. And Maggie knew that everyone in this room would soon see through the facade he had so carefully constructed. Eric continued, spinning his tale of a mother who had become a shell of herself. He exaggerated, embellishing details, weaving a story of a woman who was helpless, drowning in her own confusion. His voice never wavered, never gave away the lie that lay beneath every word. Her finances are a mess, he added with a smug, triumphant air. She can't even remember the last time she paid a bill. It's unsafe for her to be alone. I'm only doing this because I care. The courtroom sat in stunned silence for a moment. But then, Vivian rose from her seat, her movements poised and confident. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough to change the tone of the room. Your Honor, Vivian said, her voice cutting through the silence with razor-sharp precision. I'd like to cross-examine Mr. Doyle. Eric shifted slightly, his face tightening, but he didn't speak. Maggie watched as Vivian approached the witness stand, the subtle, controlled power in her every step. Vivian wasn't here to argue. She was here to dismantle Eric's lies. Vivian's first question was simple, direct. Mr. Doyle, can you please explain to the court why, if Ms. Doyle is so forgetful, you've never once reported any of these issues to a doctor or medical professional? Eric's face faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Well, I didn't think it was necessary, he stammered, but the hesitation in his voice was a crack in his armor. I've been helping her manage things. I didn't want to make it official. Vivian's eyes never wavered. So, despite your claims of mental decline, you've never sought professional advice on her health or cognitive abilities. You've never even consulted her doctor? Eric opened his mouth to respond, but the words faltered. Vivian wasn't giving him the space to retreat into his lies. She pressed on, each question methodical, each answer from Eric slowly unraveling the case he had tried to build. Vivian continued, using the evidence Maggie had so carefully collected. Financial spreadsheets that showed her careful management of her affairs, timestamps of her communications, and medical evaluations confirming her mental capacity. She asked about specific instances Eric had mentioned. Dates, events, checks that had been allegedly misplaced, and found no evidence of what he was claiming. Maggie has been meticulous in her finances, Mr. Doyle, Vivian said, her voice unwavering. These records don't show a person who is losing it. They show a person who has been managing her life with precision, despite your efforts to undermine her. Eric was beginning to unravel. His words became less coherent, his eyes flicking nervously as Vivian expertly tore apart the narrative he had so carefully constructed. Maggie watched, composed, her breath slow and steady. She had known this moment would come, the moment when Eric's lies would be exposed. And now, it was happening. Piece by piece, he was losing his grip on the story. Behind her, Maggie felt a soft presence. She turned her head just slightly and saw Hannah sitting quietly in the back row. The young girl's eyes were fixed on her father, her face unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in her posture that Maggie could see clearly. She wasn't going to be manipulated. She wasn't going to give Eric the satisfaction of using her against Maggie. Maggie's chest tightened. This was the moment she had been fighting for. Not just for her own freedom, but for her family. She wasn't just taking control of her life. She was protecting the ones she loved. Vivian finished her cross-examination, leaving Eric silent and defeated, the weight of his falsehoods hanging in the air. The room was still, and for a brief moment, all Maggie could hear was the beating of her own heart. It wasn't over yet, but the scales had tipped. Eric had already lost. The moment Maggie stood, the room seemed to shift. The weight of the entire court case hung in the air, and every set of eyes turned toward her. For the first time in what felt like forever, the spotlight was on her. Not as the victim of Eric's manipulations, but as the one in control. Her heart beat steady, strong, each pulse grounding her as she made her way to the witness stand. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't afraid. She had known this moment would come, and she had prepared for it. Maggie had learned long ago how to be silent, how to keep her thoughts hidden behind a wall of composure. But today, she wouldn't hide. Today, she would speak the truth, the whole truth. As she sat down, she could feel the weight of the gavel in her hands, the power of the words she was about to speak. She placed her hands firmly on the edge of the stand, her fingers gripping the smooth wood with quiet strength. She took a slow breath, glancing briefly at Eric, whose face had lost its earlier confidence. He was still sitting, his hands clenching into fists, his jaw set tight. He had thought this would be easy. He had thought he would walk away with control. But now, Maggie knew he understood. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing him for what he truly was. Vivian stood at her side, a quiet but steady presence. She handed Maggie the first of the binders, thick with evidence, the culmination of months of meticulous preparation. Maggie didn't flinch when the judge called for her testimony. She was ready. "Ms. Doyle," the judge said, his voice calm but firm, "please state your name and explain to the court the nature of the allegations being made against you." Maggie's voice was clear, steady, as she replied, "My name is Margaret Doyle. I am here today to address the false accusations made by my son, Eric Doyle, regarding my mental capacity and my ability to manage my affairs." Eric stiffened in his seat, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. But Maggie didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her focus was on the truth that had been twisted, manipulated, and buried under layers of lies. She was about to lift that veil. "I've been managing my finances for over 40 years," Maggie continued, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "I've maintained every receipt, tracked every bill, and managed every account. I have never been incapable of handling my own affairs." She paused, her eyes scanning the courtroom before returning to the judge. "In fact, I've always made sure to have a clear record, a precise account of my life." Vivian stepped forward, handing Maggie another binder, this one full of financial spreadsheets, bank statements, and receipts. Maggie laid them out, one by one, showing the judge the meticulous records she had kept, dates, numbers, and exact incidents that demonstrated her competence. She went over her finances piece by piece without hesitation, explaining the care she had taken in managing every detail. She named the accounts, the deposits, the withdrawals, the bills. Everything was accounted for, every number tied to a date and time. "Here, on this date," Maggie said, pointing to one of the pages, "I paid off my mortgage. Here's the confirmation email, and here's the proof of the payment. I have been diligent. I haven't forgotten a thing." She moved through the binders with precision, her voice steady and clear. She had lived this. She had kept track of everything, not just for herself but for the day when someone might try to take it all from her. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was reclaiming her life, piece by piece, in front of everyone. Eric's face had turned a shade paler. His eyes flickered with frustration and disbelief as Maggie continued. He had expected her to falter, to forget something, anything. But there was nothing to forget. Maggie had built her life on responsibility, on careful attention to detail. And now she was proving it. Every document laid bare for the court to see. Behind her, Maggie could feel the presence of her granddaughter, Hannah, sitting quietly in the back. Maggie didn't turn, but she could feel Hannah's unwavering support, a quiet strength that came from knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. Maggie hadn't needed to ask for Hannah's loyalty. It was something that had always been there, even when Eric had tried to tear them apart. Vivian continued to guide Maggie through the documents, each page adding weight to the case. When it was time to address Eric's accusations of forgetfulness, Maggie didn't waver. "He claims I misplaced checks," she said, her voice growing firmer. "But here are the records proving that I've paid every bill on time, every single one. I've never mismanaged my finances. She looked up at the judge, meeting his gaze. I manage my life just fine. The courtroom was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Eric looked rattled now, his earlier confidence replaced by a simmering unease. He had expected to break her, but Maggie was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. Sharon, sitting next to Eric, glared at Maggie, her face twisted with frustration. She leaned over to whisper something frantically to Eric's attorney, but it didn't matter. Maggie could feel it. They were losing control. Maggie sat back in her chair, her hand still steady, the binders in front of her neatly arranged. She didn't need to prove anything more. She had already won. The judge looked down at the documents one last time and then back up at Maggie. The quiet hum in the room, the lingering tension. It was all building towards something. But Maggie knew that this was the moment everything had changed. Eric had underestimated her. He had thought he could manipulate her. He was wrong. And with that, Maggie knew she had finally taken back her power. The fight wasn't over yet, but the battle had already been won. The room was quiet now, the kind of silence that fills your ears, thick with expectation. The court had just recessed for a brief moment, but the tension in the air still buzzed around Maggie like a low hum. She sat in the witness stand, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the weight of the documents she had laid out before the judge now settling into her bones. She had spoken her truth. She had exposed the lies Eric had woven. But the battle wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Vivian stood at the front of the courtroom, the final pieces of evidence in her hands. Maggie could feel the room holding its breath as the attorney carefully flipped through the last packet, each page a nail in the coffin of Eric's accusations. Vivian's sharp gaze never wavered as she handed the doctor's report to the judge, who glanced at it with interest. The report confirmed what Maggie had known all along. The doctor had evaluated her cognitive stability and found her in full possession of her mental faculties. The very thing Eric had tried to use as a weapon against her had now become the cornerstone of her defense. As the judge scanned the document, Eric shifted in his seat, his face pale, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. He had been so certain of his victory. But now, the weight of the truth was crushing him. Maggie could see it, the deflation, the slow unraveling of the confidence he had worn like armor. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightening, and for the first time since this battle began, Maggie saw the man who had once been her son falter. Eric didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared ahead, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though trying to will the evidence away with sheer willpower. But there was no denying it. The truth had been spoken, and the truth had won. Vivian was quick to act, filing the last packet of evidence, each piece more damning than the last. She moved with purpose, walking back to the table where Maggie sat, her eyes never leaving the judge. Every step she took was a victory, every piece of paper another small but undeniable triumph in their favor. Maggie watched as Vivian settled the final documents in place, the click of the binder closing echoing in the silence of the courtroom. Her pulse remained steady, calm, but inside, there was a rush of quiet relief. This was it, the endgame. She had done everything she could. She had built this case from the ground up, and now Eric had nothing left to fight with. His lies had been exposed for what they were. Hollow, fragile things, waiting to collapse under the weight of truth. Her eyes flicked to the back of the courtroom, where Hannah sat quietly. Her posture straight, her face impassive. Maggie couldn't see her eyes, but she could feel the bond between them, the silent understanding, the quiet strength that passed between grandmother and granddaughter. Hannah had been with her through this entire ordeal, never once wavering in her support. And now, in this moment, Maggie knew that it was all worth it. Not just for herself, but for the future she would protect, for the future she would rebuild. Maggie caught Hannah's gaze briefly. It was a look of reassurance, soft, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Maggie gave her a small, subtle nod. The fight wasn't over yet, but it was almost done. And as long as they had each other, they would be all right. The judge cleared his throat, snapping Maggie back to the present. He placed the doctor's report down on his desk, his eyes lifting toward Eric. For the first time, the judge's gaze seemed to hold an edge of finality. "I've reviewed the evidence presented," he said, his voice deep, steady. "This court will now break for a brief recess. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Maggie sat still as the court slowly emptied. The other attorneys filed out of the room, leaving her alone with Vivian and Carl. The door closed behind them, and Maggie took a long, slow breath, letting the tension of the day seep out of her. Carl leaned over, his voice low and calm. "You did great, Maggie. You've already won this." Maggie didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure she had won yet, but she could feel it. She could feel the change in the air, the way Eric had started to crumble under the weight of the truth. He was no longer the man who could manipulate everyone into believing his lies. He was just a man who had been caught, and he knew it. The final outcome was clear now. Vivian looked at her, the corner of her mouth twitching upward in a barely perceptible smile. "We're not done yet, Maggie," she said, "but you've done everything right. The rest is just a formality now." Maggie nodded, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. This was the end. Not the end of the fight, but the end of the control Eric had tried to impose on her life. She had fought, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside by him. And now, that fight was almost over. The gavel would fall soon. The verdict was close. And Maggie had already won. The moment the gavel came down, the weight of the room seemed to shift. Like the final, undeniable truth had pierced the veil of deception that had surrounded Eric's case. Maggie sat in the witness chair, her posture still but steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her heart beat slow, measured, as she waited for the next step, knowing that the fight was almost over. Eric's attorney had been speaking, but Maggie wasn't listening anymore. She could feel the tension in the air like a weight pushing down on her chest. But there was a quiet, undeniable strength inside her. The evidence was stacked against him. The lies had been exposed. She wasn't just waiting for a verdict. She was waiting for the final confirmation that her life, her future, would be hers again. The judge, after hearing the final round of arguments, spoke calmly. "The allegations presented by Mr. Doyle," he began, his voice even, "are not substantiated by any credible evidence. Ms. Doyle has presented ample documentation to support her capacity to manage her own affairs. We have seen no signs of mental incapacity." Eric stiffened in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, trying to find an escape from the unraveling web of his own making. But there was no escape. The damage had been done. Before Eric could say a word, Vivian stepped forward. She moved with calm authority, but there was a sharpness to her steps. She was about to drive the final nail into Eric's case. "Your Honor," Vivian began, holding up a disc, "I have footage that will demonstrate beyond a doubt the nature of Mr. Doyle's behavior. I'd like to submit this into evidence." She handed the disc over to the judge, and the courtroom fell silent. Maggie could see the flicker of unease in Eric's eyes as the judge nodded and inserted the disc into the court's projector. The lights dimmed, and a video feed appeared on the screen. The footage showed Eric, his face contorted with rage, standing outside Maggie's front door. He was banging on the door, yelling obscenities, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. Maggie watched the screen, her eyes unwavering, knowing that every moment of Eric's aggression, every moment of his emotional outburst, would speak for itself. There was no mistaking the hostility in his demeanor, the force with which he had slammed his fists against the door, the way his voice had risen in a desperate fury. It was all captured there, on film. His rage spilling out in front of her home, a desperate man who had lost control. And it wasn't just the video that proved his instability, it was the fact that Maggie had documented it, the evidence of his threat sitting squarely in front of them all. Eric's face was pale, his fists clenching at his sides. His gaze flickered toward Vivian, then back to the screen. His posture had become rigid, defensive. His lawyer was silent now, clearly lost for words. It was over. The video had done its job, and Maggie's case had been sealed. Carl, sitting beside Maggie, leaned forward slightly, his hands folded together on the table. His voice was steady and calm when he spoke, cutting through the silence. "Your Honor, I've known Maggie for over 30 years, Carl said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. I can attest to her ability to live independently. She is fully capable of managing her own affairs. The evidence is clear." He glanced at Eric briefly before continuing. "I can also testify that there has never been a sign of mental instability or forgetfulness in all the years I've known her." The judge nodded thoughtfully as he scanned the affidavits Carl had provided, his eyes moving back and forth between the documents and the screen. The weight of his earlier words seemed to hang heavier now. There was no more doubt, no more room for Eric to twist the truth. Maggie's eyes flicked briefly to the back of the courtroom where Hannah sat. The young girl hadn't spoken a word, but Maggie could see the quiet strength in her. She had been sitting still, watching the proceedings, absorbing everything. Maggie's heart swelled with pride as she saw the subtle nod that passed between them. Hannah had witnessed the lies, and she knew the truth. Then, without warning, the judge called the court to order once again, his gavel striking decisively. "I have heard the testimony," the judge said, his voice final, "and after reviewing the evidence, it is clear that Mr. Doyle's claims have no merit. There is no indication that Ms. Doyle has ever shown signs of mental decline. On the contrary, she has shown considerable control over her finances and affairs." He paused, looking directly at Eric, his gaze unwavering. "The petition for guardianship is dismissed. This case is closed." The room erupted into a quiet, stunned hush. Maggie felt the weight of the moment settle over her as the final ruling was made. Eric's head dropped, his shoulders slumping forward in defeat. He had lost, and not just the case, but his attempt to take control of her life, her independence, had been rejected by the court. Maggie sat still for a moment longer, the world around her suddenly clearer, the tension lifting from her shoulders. She had fought. She had won. Her life was her own again. Eric and his attorney gathered their things, their retreat marked by the quiet shuffling of papers. But there was no fanfare, no victory for them, only the sting of failure. As the courtroom began to empty, Maggie turned to Vivian, who stood beside her, watching the final moments with a satisfied smile. "Thank you," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Vivian simply nodded. "You did it, Maggie. The truth always wins." Maggie glanced at Carl, then at Hannah, her heart full of gratitude. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her independence. The fight was over, but the victory was hers to savor. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Maggie couldn't help but feel the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. The door had closed on Eric's manipulations, and with it, a new chapter of her life began. The days after the trial were a blur of paperwork, finality, and quiet victory. But for Maggie, each moment that passed brought with it a renewed sense of freedom, freedom that had long been denied her. The weight of the battle had lifted, and with it, the years of manipulation Eric had woven into her life. Now, she stood on the threshold of something new, something entirely hers. The first stop on her journey to reclaim her independence was her lawyer's office. Vivian had arranged for the updated wills and trusts to be drawn up, an essential task that Maggie had put off for too long. It had always felt like something she could do later, but now that the burden of Eric's control had been lifted, it was time to finalize the future she had always wanted. Maggie sat in the chair across from Vivian's desk, the thick papers before her feeling strangely weighty. This wasn't just a legal formality. This was Maggie taking control of her legacy, her future. It was a small act, but it was one of the most important things she'd ever done. Vivian handed her the pen with a steady, professional gesture. "You're sure about the changes?" she asked, her voice quiet but reassuring. Maggie looked at the papers in front of her, the documents that named her granddaughter Hannah as the sole beneficiary of her estate. She had thought about this decision for a long time. Eric's betrayal had forced her to take this step, but she had never once wavered in her conviction that Hannah was the only one who deserved this trust. "I'm sure," Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. She dipped the pen into the ink and began to sign, each stroke of the pen an assertion of her autonomy. With every word she signed, Maggie felt the years of tension and regret begin to dissolve. Once the final document was signed, Vivian filed it away in an envelope, her expression one of quiet approval. "All done. You've taken the necessary steps," she said, glancing at Maggie. "This will protect your wishes, and it will ensure Eric has no further claim over your affairs." Maggie nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. Her life, the life she had worked for, was finally hers to protect, to shape. There was no more interference, no more control. Eric had lost his grip. After leaving the law office, Maggie and Carl took the documents to a secure storage facility, ensuring that everything was kept safe. Carl, as always, was steady and reliable. He made sure to set up a secure place for the important papers, where Eric couldn't reach them, and where Maggie's wishes would be honored. "Everything's in place now, Maggie," Carl said, his voice warm with the reassurance that Maggie needed. "You've done it." Maggie smiled at him, grateful for the support he had given her over the years. Carl had been more than just a neighbor. He had been a friend, a confidant, and in many ways, a protector. "I couldn't have done it without you," Maggie replied, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you." A few days later, Maggie found herself at the local community center, where a senior walking group had recently begun. She had hesitated at first, uncertain about the idea of joining a group of strangers, but after everything, after the years of isolation, she knew it was time to step out into the world again. It was time to reclaim her joy. The group met in the park every morning, a mix of elderly men and women who had found camaraderie in their shared walks. Maggie had joined them several times already, and each time she felt a little more at ease. There was something about the rhythm of walking, about the connection with nature and the light conversation that came with it, that made her feel alive again. On one of her walks, she found herself in the quiet of the park, watching the ducks glide across the water, the sun's golden light sparkling on the surface. She realized as she stood there that she hadn't felt this at peace in years. The world had changed, and so had she. This was her life now, her decisions, her future, and it was beautiful. Later that afternoon, as she passed by a small boutique, Maggie noticed a display of silver pens in the window. One in particular caught her eye. Small, simple, with delicate engraving along the barrel. It seemed like the perfect symbol of her victory. Something both elegant and practical, a tool to mark the start of a new chapter in her life. Maggie stepped inside and bought the pen, her fingers brushing the smooth surface as she felt the weight of it in her palm. This wasn't just a pen. It was a reminder. A reminder that she had fought for this moment, that she had taken back control. With this pen, she would write her own story from now on. That evening, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the pen in her hand. a soft smile tugging at her lips. She wrote a letter to Hannah, thanking her for her support, for her strength, for standing by her side through everything. She would give it to her the next time they met. Hannah had always been the light in her life. And now, Maggie would pass on everything she had worked for, knowing it was in good hands. As she placed the letter in an envelope, she felt something inside her stir, a quiet, undeniable certainty. Eric was gone from her life. The fight had ended. And now, she was free to live, to write her own future, and to pass on a legacy of independence, strength, and love. The life Eric could no longer control had begun anew. The room was filled with the soft hum of voices, the murmur of excited conversations, and the clink of glasses. It was the night of Hannah's art event, a celebration of her talent, her hard work, and the quiet strength that had been with her all along. Maggie sat in the audience, her back straight and her posture calm, but inside, she felt a flutter of pride for her granddaughter. This moment was everything. This was where she could finally see the proof of how much she had fought, how much she had won. Vivian stood beside her, her professional demeanor still intact, but even she seemed to take a small private satisfaction in the moment. She had been with Maggie every step of the way, guiding her, supporting her, and now, standing here in the glow of victory, there was a peace in her eyes. Maggie could see it. Even in the quiet way Vivian smiled. As the event went on, Maggie watched Hannah as she mingled with the other guests, her bright eyes focused on the future. She looked every bit the young woman who had stood beside Maggie through the most difficult chapters of her life. The way Hannah greeted people, how she laughed easily, how she carried herself. It was clear that the future held great things for her. Then, at the far end of the room, Maggie spotted him. Eric. He stood in the corner, his posture stiff, his arms crossed as if to shield himself from the crowd. He glanced around, his eyes flicking uneasily between the guests, avoiding eye contact with Maggie. And he looked small. The man who had once dominated her life now seemed so distant, so diminished. The arrogant confidence he had carried throughout the trial was gone. He was a shadow of the man who had tried to manipulate and control. Maggie didn't look at him for long. She didn't need to. She was no longer interested in the man who had tried to break her. She had already won, and she knew, deep in her bones, that this was the final proof. It wasn't just the dismissal of the guardianship petition that signaled the end. It was the way Eric stood there now, defeated, isolated. The truth of his lies was final. There was no more power to take from Maggie, no more control to exert. He had nothing left. Maggie's thoughts were interrupted as Hannah approached her, a broad smile lighting up her face. The young woman's arms opened wide as she leaned in and embraced Maggie tightly, wrapping her arms around her grandmother in a simple, unspoken gesture of love and loyalty. It was a quiet victory, one Maggie could feel deep in her chest. The battle had been for this, the peace of knowing that Hannah was safe, that their bond was unbreakable. "Grandma," Hannah whispered, pulling back to look at her. Her eyes were bright, filled with unshed tears of happiness. "You did it. I'm so proud of you." Maggie smiled softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, sweetheart." Hannah squeezed her hand, a look of quiet admiration in her eyes before she glanced over at Eric. Maggie followed her gaze, and for the first time, she saw Eric truly for what he was, defeated. The look in his eyes, the way he stood there, so isolated and small against the backdrop of a room filled with warmth and life, told her everything she needed to know. Eric had lost. Vivian joined them, her quiet, confident presence filling the space. She handed Maggie a folder, the official envelope containing the certified copy of the court dismissal. Maggie opened it carefully, the weight of it sinking in, the finality of the judge's words, the documents that marked the end of a long and painful chapter. She looked at Vivian, a slow smile tugging at her lips. I thought you might want to see this, Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a quiet pride. It's over, Maggie. He has no claim left. Maggie nodded, holding the envelope in her hands. She could feel the weight of it. The years of manipulation, the battles, the lies, all now sealed in that simple final piece of paper. Eric had no claim over her life, her future, her finances. Not anymore. She had won. She turned slowly, her eyes finding Eric once more. He was still watching them, his face blank, the emptiness of defeat written all over his features. He couldn't take it back now. He couldn't change the past. He had tried to break her, tried to destroy everything she had built. But Maggie had stood firm, and the truth had been her weapon. With one last look at Eric, Maggie turned back to her granddaughter, her future, the life she was about to continue building. The world felt different now, lighter, freer. She had already fought the hardest battle of her life, and won. As the evening wore on, the sounds of laughter and music filled the air. Maggie moved through the crowd with calm dignity, her head held high. She was no longer the woman who had been manipulated by Eric's lies. She was the woman who had reclaimed her life, her independence, and her peace. And nothing, not even Eric, could ever take that away. As she walked beside Vivian, the weight of the day behind her, Maggie glanced over at her lawyer. You were right, Maggie said softly. The truth always wins. Vivian's smile was small but genuine. It does, Maggie. It always does. And as Maggie looked around at the people who had stood by her, her heart swelling with quiet satisfaction, she knew. This was just the beginning of her new life. The case was over, but the journey had only just begun. He lied about my mind, but the truth cost him his entire case.